Okay. Are we live? I have no idea. I never know. It's always just a mystery. I hope everyone's doing amazing. Thank you for joining me. Um, so I just wanted to go through, I had this question come in. Do awakened people still have an ego? Um, I actually think that the majority of our collective, including most of the spiritual teachers that we find on YouTube, are currently in a stage of awakening. Uh, we can really quickly identify where someone is uh, by what they're doing, um, but also by the way that they reference themselves in reference to the environment. And it kind of becomes a little bit obvious. And this isn't a criticism. This is just an observation of where consciousness is in regards to the forms of consciousness that are emanating, you could say, teachings of unity, oneness, or 5D, Christ consciousness, these concepts, or going into the law of attraction and the manifestation and how to attract the right lover. Right, we can see sort of quite obviously where some of these places are, or where some of the teachers are coming from. And so I think I took the question as like awakened. Okay, so I thought of immediately Buddha saying, I am awake. Wow, I'm awake. So who is there? I mean, not many, right? Not the majority of the people that we watch. Though certainly plenty, right? Plenty, but not many in respect to our population. So what I thought I would talk about is the progression that an entity that is evolving out of third density consciousness will take as it moves third, fourth, fifth, sixth density consciousness. It tends to go sort of a particular way. Here we have something that we refer to as the ego. The ego could be considered, the way I would tend to frame it is the activity of identifying. So it isn't a thing, actually, right? It's not a container. It's not a being. It's not an entity. It's an activity we do in our mind, right? So that activity of ego continues, right? What changes about it is what I tend to do is switch it into persona. Because in order for us to have activity, physicality, and activity here, we are going to be sort of moving into doing something, right? Being some way with other forms of consciousness, other fractals, other lenses and perspectives the creator has of itself. The reason for that fractal to exist is to be itself authentically, so that the other self can observe it authentically. Like, that's the purpose of life itself. That's why life exists, really. And so ego then doesn't fall away, really. What happens is it becomes what I just call persona instead of ego. The only reason I distinguish between them, truly they're the same thing, but the only reason I distinguish between them is because ego here in society is seen as a bad thing. Like, we seem to be saddened when we feel we've been egoic, but it's natural for us to be into an identity. When we're coming out of third density, that's what's natural. It's natural, literally, for us to be confused, the what we are and where we are, and we've just awakened a bit. Most of us have just sort of opened our eyes and we're like, what the fuck? That's where most of us are at. So, and even people that don't realize that that's what's happening, that's where a lot of those people are. They're not into any of these concepts, and they're just like, oh my God, everything is a nightmare, right? But they'll figure it out. They'll get led their way. So we can separate ego, really, or persona. We can see it different ways, but what I would say is that ego becomes more and more and more aligned with truth. That's all that happens. Ego becomes persona, which becomes truth of the soul, which then becomes perfection or mastery. That's the trajectory that the ego follows as it develops an identity. Without identity, there's no actor, so there's no experience other than love, which is great. It's great to experience that and to be that. I call that the void. So if we're in that state here in a body, that's what I call the void. It's not a bad thing. It's the nothingness or allness of infinity. And holding that vibration is very helpful to humanity. So it's a very noble task even to seek that, right? But for most of us that are here, we want to like be human still, right? Like not human, but we want to be in the separation still. Like there's stuff we want to do with other people, right? There's things with others we want to experience. Because we have to own that we have this drive to experience separation. Like it's still there a bit, right? We still desire this or that and this. Ah, interesting, right? And as we notice these desires and realize separation can't be, and that the earth is moving out of frequencies that will abide it, like we those of us who are ready to awaken will not be able to ignore that there isn't separation, that we're just fighting ourselves with things. So I'll go into sort of the stages that I like to, that I like to discern as far as ego development. And of course, we could put this anyway, and I'm sure there are other systems, but ultimately, I want to keep things as simple as we can and try to say it's all sort of the same thing until it's unified with source, which is when we're done doing things, like we're done being things, right? So do we want to rush to be done everything? If we do, then okay, great. I would say go seek that void path probably. And you'll probably be offered an opportunity to leave the frame. So, that's what I would say. But it starts with unconscious ego. This is what we tend to call like sleeping. It's autonomous, like, and I'm talking like our default mode. We can have like kind of a bit of an awakened state and then fall into a sleepier state as well and come back up, and as we're sort of stumbling out of dream states, we do that. It's almost like if you've ever had a night where you're in and out of consciousness a bit, like you're asleep and then you're kind of awake and then you're like asleep again. It's not dissimilar to that for many awakening experiences. But some of us, myself included, have this just a massive Kundalini awakening or some type of ridiculous experience that either we tried to solicit from the universe or we didn't, but for whatever reason we had this experience. And that's when we tend to move into now the next stage, which is spiritual ego. So our unconscious ego is like when we're literally just autonomous, survival based. I am sort of an animal human being thing. I'm separate from God, separate from everything else that's around me. Everything is an else. Everything is other than myself. So I then develop post-traumatic stress, basically. And I react from my post-traumatic stress, from this separation from the divine as well, which is all veiled to me. I don't realize that I'm just really terrified because I can't feel where my mother and father are. That's really what's happening, and that I'm just freaking out. And that stress, the post-traumatic stress of that on the soul, is all veiled. And the human then, oh, okay, I get it. I have senses, I have eyes, and I can see this and that. There's a threat over there. And oh, I better say this. And it gets emotional. Our animalistic threat impulses start to react with just our speech even. So it seems like they're attacking us. We react as if we better attack back, the same way we would if our territory was being threatened or something. We've just sort of shifted the way we battle, and now we do try to do it intellectually or emotionally, which is really the same thing. It's just mind stuff that we do with each other, and that's all our unconscious ego. But then we go into the next stage, which is our spiritual ego. This is what actually happens when we begin to wake up. It's actually basically required, almost. It's like required learning in a way. It's where we learn good and bad. Like, what is good? What is bad to us? What do we see as evil? What do we see as loving? We work on these polarities to refine them. But while we're doing that, we tend to look at reflections in the mirrors to see the things we don't want and the things that we think are evil, and see the things that we think are good. We're trying to pick and choose because we're our creator being, and we're trying to discern, well, what's light for me? What's dark for me? And actually, these things are unique, soul to soul to soul. This is where we begin to feel that we are spiritual, but everyone else might be asleep. Oh, all these everyones that are, but obviously there isn't anyone else. And consciousness and awareness has been eternally. So who's saying all that, right? That's the spiritual ego that's, it's basically become sort of aware of the truth, but hasn't relinquished the habitual identification that happens in the ego, right? It hasn't let go that, like I've seen that I'm not the body, but I'm still gonna play the game. I'm still gonna pretend I'm the body for a bit, even though I know the truth. This is why they get, we get so sensitive in this stage, so sensitive to everything, because everything, we're feeling it for once in our lives, really. We're finally feeling the world. We're seeing the catalyst. We're seeing the duality, the paradoxes, and the ways we lie to ourselves. We're seeing it. But we still have the ego duality framework that's running, that's kind of spinning things into distortion. So we're not seeing things properly. The mind's basically misunderstanding that, like I said before, consciousness was never asleep. The one was always watching, right? The awareness of one, God, was always there. We're just realizing sort of, oh, okay. Yeah, so, well, isn't that funny? Isn't that funny? I guess I wasn't asleep. The character even was the one that was asleep. I was never asleep. I'm the awareness. I'm the observing point, the singularity behind the being or the constructed self. And I was never asleep. And neither are they, right? But that's where that spiritual ego develops into. Like, it sort of and it's a different time frame for everyone. Souls are, some are younger, not as experienced in awakening. Some are like, they grew up on Earth or came over from Mars and Maldek, and they hadn't ascended into fourth yet. That's some of the souls that are ascending right now. They haven't done this before, but the star-seeded and the wanderers, the volunteers, have done this before. So we're at varying degrees better or quicker, you could say. Just a little faster at it, not necessarily better, more naturally. But that's not to say that a third density soul that's awakening into fourth isn't going to just pick it up and do it even better. That's sort of what happened in my case. I was a star-seeded soul and had the walk-in experience. And so I feel like I cheated. I cheated somehow, almost. I didn't have to do a lot of this. I did get into the spiritual ego a bit, but not to some of the degrees that I've seen. But then, anyways, the next it doesn't even matter. Like even that statement there is the spiritual ego speaking. It's like the part of me that wants to discourse on what Sean did, as if Sean is doing anything. Like it's not real. Right? It's so funny to say. But it's not real. So even that conversation is like spiritual ego. So it's sort of like I have to put a spiritual ego on to act in this back and forth we're doing as friends, brothers, sisters, one consciousness of Earth that's expanding. For me to act, Sean has to exist. And for Sean to exist, he has to wear something. And we could call that a spiritual ego. Right? Or we could call it persona, which is what I prefer because it's nicer, right? It's a little sexier. Yeah, I could be a persona. Hell yeah. I guess, right? I don't know why I'm getting so excited over it, but the next stage is awake. This is where Buddha approaches, right? Like I'm lessening the standards. I'm not saying we have to be Buddha-like here. I think Buddha was a master. So there's a difference between being awake and being a master to me. Awake is when we could call this enlightenment, I would say. This is where you're aware that whatever is happening with the body, you are not this. You simply aren't. So there couldn't be a threat anywhere, right? You're awake. You've refined also what your goodness is. Like you've learned from the spiritual ego what you feel is good and what you feel is not great. And you're sort of learning how to tune in with what the universe is calling for. Or God, what God's asking of you, really, is the way I would say that. What is God asking of me in this moment? That's more the situation, but you still have questions, you still have confusion, you still have some emotional turbulence. But outwardly, you're not as reactive. You know what this is. You know what's going on. Occasionally you may fall into a slumber, but I would say the majority of the time you're aware and conscious that this is a separation illusion, a holographic reality that's it's a projection of myself onto everything, and everyone's doing the same thing to me. And that's just the running understanding. At this stage as well, this is where linear and nonlinear thought start to really battle with each other, as the rational mind wants to try to tie into the story of the narrative between people in time. And the nonlinear mind understands more of the infinite and isn't thinking that way. and so there becomes this conflict that happens, and that ends up being sort of some of the nuance that's engaged with in between. And the next stage, though, is mastery. Mastery is when the archetypal expression of the logos, the different personalities or the archetypal personas of the logos, are harmonized into a purity of love. So what this means is that the master does not ever make a mistake, really. Doesn't make mistakes, doesn't do things sloppily. Absolutely no error of any kind. No confusion, no questions even. Barely any even thinking, really. Not even really considering anything. That's where mastery lays. And despite what it might sound like, it's a blissful experience. So I've experienced mastery in some limited forms. Limited different forms. I've noticed, oh, I have mastery here. And that's what I encourage you all to notice, is there are things that I am a bit of a master in. Like, naturally, I can just make it perfect, the thing. Whatever the thing. I can do it perfectly. It could even be something as dumb as, like, not dumb, I shouldn't call it dumb, but painting our nails or something. I do that perfectly. Like, wow, every time I do that, it's masterful. And also my intention is all into it, and I'm in a flow state, right? So a master is someone that's balanced all of the archetypal expressions of the logos, which is, I tend to recommend people use the major arcana to understand those. The major arcana, the 22 archetypes. That is the archetypes that we used on Venus, and we should use them here. Because that's how we understand how to discipline the personality, which is how we become a master, or actually even become awake. We can actually be sort of, you could imagine it like this. We have 22 people in us, and we have to learn how to be each one of those balanced. Every time we're a different one of those, we're shifting into these. We're shapeshifters, really, by nature. Our consciousness shapeshifts into these 22 archetypes, and we can find them. We look at the Hierophant, the teacher and traditional sort of like wisdom giver, and how do I try to give wisdom? Am I a little arrogant when I speak? And I know this is something I struggle with, like, because as we become more sure of what we're saying and more certain with ourselves, we come across more arrogant, usually, because we have more conviction. And conviction and confidence in what we say can come across as arrogant, especially when other people don't have a lot of confidence in what they say. They're sort of like, well, he must be faking it or something, or pretending or lying, or just thinking he must know, or whatever. And we experience these different things. But in mastery, we end up, none of that stuff's really being considered. We're flowing with God-like presence. We're being God in the moment. And you're all already doing it, is the main point that I'm making. So mastery, bringing that to everything, isn't that far away. It's not unachievable. It's not like something that we are not going to make. It is actually the path. It is actually where everyone's going to go. Mastery, which will be a bringing a pure, loving, open heart to everything all the time. There will not be another way to be in time as we move forward. And many of us are meant to help show that way. And all we have to do to show that way is try to do that now. Try to realize that's where it's going. Oh, I get it. That's where the earth is going. Everyone's told me I'm a way shower. I'm going to show the way, which is forgiveness, love, peace, harmony. Oh, mastery. You know, it's a tall order for a lot of us, right? Myself included. It's a tall order. I'm no master. I'm no master. So many flaws in so many things that I do and think. Uncountable flaws. And the ego would love to go on about them forever, right? Forever. Hi, Stacia. Glad to catch alive. Thank you. Thank you for catching alive. Maria C says, I feel the big difference now is that I see the ego, hence it doesn't control me as much anymore. You have been a help on this journey. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm so grateful. I think seeing the ego is that's why I'm trying to make it less problematic that we even have an ego. Of course, the ego exists, but even when I said we have an ego, there isn't an ego. It's just our beliefs that we actually shift. So we can't. People talk about letting go of the ego, and even I've said this. So I'm guilty of this. But it's not quite that way. We're changing our ego. I think it was Aleister Crowley who taught that ego continues. And it does. The only reason we are dissuaded from ego is because we've had so many different people tell us so many different things about ego that it seems like it's some kind of problem. And if I have any ego, then I'm a jerk or something, right? But it's not totally true. Not totally true. The ego just shifts, and it shifts from the persona, and the persona basically is just coming more and more and more into alignment with God and what God's persona would be. Like if God was here, what would God do? Right? Like, but our mind doesn't know what God would do. And so instead of going, oh, I know what God would do, we ask, and we honestly, we instantly usually receive what God would do. And we start to just be that all the time. And in that, everyone sees peace, love, power, mercy, whatever is needed to be shown. So it ends up being more simply that we have beliefs that are true, we have beliefs that are not true. And we could say that the not true beliefs are ego. And the true beliefs are then persona. Because belief is outside of God. If that makes sense? So anything outside of God is a fabrication, right? Of some kind. So if it's a belief, then it's limited. It's a construct. It's something we've made. So the persona has to be that. The ego is that too. They're both equally the same exact thing. Just ego is perceived generally as something that bugs us, something that gets in the way. So we want to create, line ego to your higher self. Exactly. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, that's exactly it. As our higher self raises, because our perception as a human of what our higher self is very ignorant, usually. We can't actually see from the perspective of our higher self, typically immediately, so we guess at it, right? And then we go, oh, and that's what expands us up, is we keep trying to see the higher self. And the trick is that there's always a higher self until we go, oh, it's God. God is the higher self. There's one self. There's one. And that's it. So who's my higher self? Like, that couldn't really make any sense. Not in truth. In truth, it must be that there's one, right? And we remember as well that the only true English statement is I am. That's it. Everything else that's any person, including myself, has ever said is distorted and not totally true. Like if I say something like I'm loving, it's true, but it's limiting because I'm other things too, right? I'm everything. I'm loving, but I'm also sometimes I'm not loving, right? It seems that way. You know, it's important that we notice these polarities, I think. But yeah, I think that's all I wanted to talk about today. I'm super grateful. Appreciate you all. Thank you so much. I'm wearing the same shirt that I wore on Friday, I think, because I'm I'm a slob. I don't. It's okay. It's okay. I didn't go anywhere. I didn't leave. I wore the same shirt. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate all of you taking your time. And thank you, Mark. Yeah, best version of yourself now. And then the higher self. Thank you, Mark, actually, for saying that. The best version of yourself, the higher self, is usually the part the ego's pointing at, being like, "Hey, you're not there yet. You're not there yet." Right? The higher self is not attainable that way because it's higher. And so the ego points at it to be like, we gotta be that now. But that's the ideal. We have to become the ideal through a transition process, you could say. The ego just wants us to feel like shit for not being like it yet, immediately. So it's an interesting trap the ego plays on us, spiritually speaking, you could say. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you. I hope you have a beautiful weekend and a wonderful night. Take care.